After 32 years of marriage, retired teacher Frank Whitmore becomes suspicious when his wife Lillian begins taking late-night walks into the nearby forest. When he finally follows her, he discovers a secret that unearths decades of hidden trauma, a buried crime, and a web of lies stretching back to a vanished child in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The clock struck midnight, its chimes slicing through the stillness of Frank's quiet home. He sat in his recliner by the window, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, staring out at the dense forest that stretched endlessly behind their property. It had been 3 months since he'd retired from his job as an accountant, a career that had consumed 40 years of his life. And now, with nothing but time on his hands, he found himself restless in ways he hadn't anticipated. Lillian was different too. She'd always been the steady one, the anchor of their marriage. But lately, something about her seemed off. Her laughter didn't ring quite as freely during dinner, and there were moments when she'd stare into space for so long that Frank would have to call her name twice before she snapped back to reality. It started 2 weeks ago, the walks. At first, Frank thought it was just insomnia or cabin fever, but every night like clockwork, Lillian would slip out of bed while he lay feigning sleep. He'd hear the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint jingle of keys as she unlocked the back door, and then the gentle click as it shut behind her. Each time he resisted the urge to follow her, telling himself it wasn't his place to pry. But tonight, curiosity got the better of him. He waited 10 minutes after she left before grabbing his flashlight and pulling on his boots. The air outside was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. Frank hesitated at the tree line, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement deeper within the woods. "Lillian?" he called softly, stepping forward. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. There was no response, only the rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. He pressed on, following the narrow path they'd walked together countless times over the years. This part of the forest was familiar territory. They'd often taken leisurely strolls here on summer afternoons. But tonight, it felt foreign, almost menacing. Every snapping twig made him jump. Every shadow seemed to shift just out of reach. Finally, he spotted her. Lillian stood near the old stone well, hidden deep in the woods, her silhouette illuminated faintly by the moonlight. She wasn't moving, just staring down into the dark abyss of the well. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her face, when she turned slightly, he could see it clearly even from a distance. Haunted. That was the only word for it. Frank's heart clenched. "Lillian," he said again, louder this time. She startled, turning fully toward him. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights, panic flashing across her features. Then abruptly, she composed herself, smoothing her hair with trembling hands. "Frank, what are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his tone gentler than he felt. He approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "You've been coming out here every night. Why didn't you tell me?" "It's nothing," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. I needed some air, some quiet." "You don't need to walk all the way out here for that." He gestured to the house barely visible through the trees. "We have a porch." She sighed, wrapping her arms around herself as if warding off a chill. "I know, I just needed to be alone." Something about the way she said it, the weight in her voice, made Frank's stomach twist. This wasn't just about needing solitude. There was more to it, something she wasn't ready to share. Or maybe something she couldn't. Before he could press further, she glanced back at the well, her expression unreadable. "Let's go inside," she murmured. "It's getting late." Frank nodded reluctantly, though his eyes lingered on the well. There was something unsettling about it, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. As they walked back to the house in silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever secret Lillian was keeping was tied to that ancient, crumbling structure, and that it might change everything between them. Back inside, Lillian climbed into bed without another word, leaving Frank standing in the hallway, flashlight still in hand. He stared at the closed bedroom door, his mind racing. Whatever was haunting Lillian, it wasn't going to stay buried forever. And Frank knew sooner or later he'd have to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting things neither of them was prepared to face. The next morning, Frank awoke to the faint aroma of coffee wafting through the house. Lillian was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, an act so normal it made the events of the previous night feel like a dream. But Frank knew better. The image of her standing by the old stone well, bathed in moonlight, haunted him still. After breakfast, Lillian announced she was heading in town to run errands. As soon as the car disappeared down the gravel driveway, Frank found himself drawn to her writing desk in the corner of the living room. It was an antique piece they'd picked up at a flea market years ago, ornate and sturdy, with tiny drawers lining its sides. He'd never paid much attention to it before, but now something about it seemed significant. He opened the top drawer absently, expecting to find pens or notepads. Instead, his fingers brushed against cold metal, a small brass key tucked beneath a stack of envelopes. His pulse quickened. The key looked old, almost ceremonial, and it didn't belong to any door in the house that he knew of. Then his eyes fell on the middle drawer. Unlike the others, this one had a lock. Frank hesitated, gripping the key tightly in his hand. Was this what Lillian had been hiding? A journal? Letters? Whatever it was, it clearly wasn't meant for prying eyes, and yet the temptation gnawed at him. If there was even a chance it could explain her midnight walks, her haunted expression, maybe even the whispers he thought he'd heard last night. But no. Breaking into her private things felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. With a sigh, he placed the key back where he'd found it and closed the drawer. For now, he would respect her privacy, even if it killed him. That evening, after Lillian went to bed early, citing a headache, Frank decided to retrace her path into the woods. Armed with a flashlight and wearing boots laced tightly against the damp chill, he stepped outside under the cover of darkness. The forest greeted him with its usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves. But tonight, the air felt heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. He followed the same trail they'd taken countless times over the years, sticking close to the narrow dirt path. At first, everything seemed normal. The towering pines, the occasional hoot of an owl. But then halfway to the well, he realized something was wrong. Her footprints, which should have been visible in the soft earth, were gone. Or rather, they stopped abruptly, as though she'd simply vanished into thin air. Frank frowned, shining his flashlight around the area. "Lillian?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer came, only the sound of the wind weaving through the trees. He pressed on, determined to reach the well. But the deeper he ventured, the more uneasy he became. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the silence grew oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig behind him. And then he heard it, a whisper, so faint he almost convinced himself it was his imagination. He froze, straining to listen. There it was again, carried on the breeze like a ghostly echo. "Don't look!" Frank spun around, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice louder this time. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. Yet the sensation of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. "Leave it alone," the voice murmured again, closer this time, or so it seemed. His breath hitched. Was this paranoia playing tricks on him? Or was someone or something trying to warn him away? Before he could investigate further, a sudden gust of wind extinguished his flashlight, plunging him into near total blackness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the switch, cursing under his breath. When the light flickered back on, he wasted no time turning around and retracing his steps, practically jogging back toward the safety of the house. By the time he reached the porch, his shirt was damp with sweat, despite the cool night air. He glanced over his shoulder at the forest, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at him. But all he saw were shadows, shifting lazily in the moonlight. Inside, Frank locked the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to steady his breathing. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't natural, and whatever secret Lillian was keeping, it was bigger than he'd imagined. As he climbed the stairs to check on her, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay somewhere between the locked drawer and the old stone well, and that uncovering them might come at a cost neither of them was prepared to pay. The following afternoon, Frank rummaged through the cluttered shelves in the basement, searching for a fresh pack of flashlight batteries. His mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous night. The whispers, the vanishing footprints, the oppressive weight of the forest, and he found himself pacing restlessly between tasks. Sleep had been elusive, his dreams haunted by fragmented images of shadowy figures and echoing voices. Now daylight offered little comfort. The unease lingered like an unwelcome guest. As he shifted aside a box of holiday decorations, something caught his eye. A dusty leather-bound photo album wedged behind a stack of old magazines. It wasn't one he recognized. Curiosity tugged at him, and he pulled it free, brushing off decades of accumulated grime. The cover was worn but embossed with delicate gold lettering that read Memories. He hesitated for a moment, then flipped it open. The first few pages held nothing unusual, faded snapshots of family gatherings, birthday parties, vacations to places they'd both long forgotten. But as he turned to the middle section, his breath hitched. There, staring up at him from the yellowed page, was a photograph of Lillian standing in front of a rustic wooden cabin, her arm wrapped protectively around the shoulders of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Frank's stomach dropped. They had never had children. It wasn't a topic they discussed often, not since the heartbreak of their early marriage when they discovered Lillian couldn't conceive, but it was a fact etched into the fabric of their lives. Yet here she was, smiling warmly at the camera, her expression radiating love and pride. And the boy? There was no mistaking the resemblance. His hair was dark like hers, his eyes wide and curious, mirroring the same tilt of her smile. Frank stared at the picture for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing. Who was this child? Where had the photo been taken? And why had Lillian never mentioned any of it? Questions swirled in his head, each one more unsettling than the last. He flipped the photo over, hoping for some kind of inscription, but the back was blank. He closed the album gently, his hands trembling slightly. Part of him wanted to march upstairs and demand answers right then and there. But another part, a quieter, more cautious voice, urged him to wait. Whatever this secret was, it ran deep. Confronting Lillian without understanding the full context might only drive her further away. Later that evening, as they sat together in the living room watching the news, Frank stole glances at Lillian. She seemed distracted, flipping absently through the pages of a magazine without really reading it. Her brow furrowed occasionally, as though she were wrestling with some internal conflict. He wanted to reach out, to ask if she was okay, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he focused on piecing together what little information he had. The cabin in the photo looked familiar somehow, though he couldn't place it. Perhaps it was somewhere nearby, somewhere hidden within the vast expanse of forest behind their home. If he could find it, maybe he'd uncover clues about the boy and why Lillian had kept him a secret all these years. But even as he formulated a plan, doubt crept in. What if the truth was something he wasn't ready to face? What if the boy in the photograph wasn't just a missing chapter of their past, but a key to unraveling everything they thought they knew about each other? By the time Lillian announced she was going to bed early again, Frank's head was spinning. He kissed her goodnight absent-mindedly, then retreated to his recliner by the window, staring out at the darkened woods. Somewhere out there, buried beneath layers of earth and memory, lay answers waiting to be unearthed. And Frank knew, no matter how much trepidation gripped his heart, he wouldn't rest until he found them. For now, though, he let the questions simmer, biding his time. Tomorrow would bring clarity, or so he hoped. The next night, Frank's determination outweighed his fear. Armed with a flashlight and a resolve that bordered on desperation, he waited until Lillian slipped out of the house once more. This time he wouldn't lose her trail. He moved quietly through the forest, careful to stay far enough behind so she wouldn't notice him. The moonlight filtered unevenly through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the ground. But it was just enough for him to follow without stumbling. He kept his breathing steady as he tracked her movements, his pulse quickening when she veered off the familiar path. She pushed aside thick branches and stepped over roots, heading deeper into the woods than Frank had ever dared go alone. His mind raced. What could possibly be out here? Was this where the whispers came from? Where the boy in the photograph fit into their lives? After what felt like an eternity, Lillian stopped. Frank crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, peering through the darkness. Ahead of her stood a structure nearly swallowed by time, a moss-covered cabin nestled between towering pine trees. Its wooden walls sagged slightly under the weight of years, and ivy crept up its sides like nature reclaiming its own. The roof was patched with missing shingles, and one of the windows was cracked, jagged glass glinting faintly in the moonlight. Lillian hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. Frank's heart pounded as he crept closer, keeping to the shadows. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he pressed himself against the rough bark of a tree, listening intently. There were no sounds at first, just the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Then came the faintest murmur, a voice so quiet it might have been mistaken for the wind. Summoning his courage, Frank inched toward the cabin. He stayed close to the wall, avoiding the creaky floorboards of the porch, until he found the cracked window. Peering inside, his breath caught in his throat. Lillian sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, surrounded by small toys, an old wooden train, a ragged stuffed bear, a few faded action figures. They looked ancient, relics of another era. Her hands trembled as she arranged them carefully, almost reverently, whispering softly under her breath. Eli. Her voice broke on the name, filled with a tenderness and sorrow that cut straight through Frank's chest. I'm sorry. I should have come sooner. Frank's grip tightened on the windowsill as he stared at her, his mind reeling. Eli. The name echoed in his thoughts, dredging up fragments of memory buried long ago. He'd heard it before, or at least part of it. It couldn't be. Could it? She leaned forward, brushing imaginary dirt from the toys, her lips moving silently now. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked and unashamed. For a moment, she seemed younger somehow. Not the woman he'd shared decades of life with, but someone else entirely. Someone burdened by grief too heavy to carry alone. Frank backed away slowly, his vision blurring with questions he couldn't yet answer. Who was Eli? Why had Lillian hidden this place and these memories from him? And why did it feel like the truth was unraveling threads of their marriage they thought were unbreakable? As he retreated into the woods, his footsteps silent despite the turmoil raging within him, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever secret Lillian had been carrying wasn't just hers. It belonged to both of them. And uncovering it would change everything. The confrontation came the next morning, after Frank had spent a sleepless night replaying the scene in the cabin over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Lillian whispering that name, Eli, or the way her voice had trembled with grief. It wasn't just sorrow he'd seen, it was guilt, and it gnawed at him like an open wound. When she entered the kitchen, her usual calm demeanor masking whatever storm brewed beneath the surface, Frank didn't waste time. Who's Eli? He asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Lillian froze mid-step, coffee mug in hand. For a moment, she looked as though she might deny knowing anything, but then her shoulders sagged and she set the mug down slowly. She turned to face him, her expression guarded, yet tinged with something deeper. Fear, perhaps, or regret. Where did you hear that name? She asked quietly. I saw you last night, Frank said, his voice low but firm. At the cabin. You were talking to someone, to Eli. The words felt strange on his tongue, foreign and heavy. Who is he, Lillian? What aren't you telling me? Her eyes darted away, focusing on some invisible point beyond his shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. It's not something I can explain right now. Not something you can explain. Frank's frustration bubbled to the surface. Or not something you want to explain. That's our son's name, isn't it? Our child we never talked about. No, she snapped, cutting him off. Her sudden vehemence startled him into silence. She took a shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. He wasn't, she trailed off, shaking her head as if trying to dispel the memories crowding her thoughts. Please, Frank, just leave it alone. But Frank couldn't leave it alone. Not now, not after everything he'd seen. He opened his mouth to press further, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. There was pain there, yes, but also a plea, a desperate warning not to push any harder. Whatever the secret was, it ran deeper than he could fathom. She left the room without another word, retreating upstairs and closing the bedroom door behind her. Frank stood there staring at the empty space where she'd been, his heart pounding. He wanted to follow her, to demand answers until she broke, but something held him back. Maybe it was the raw vulnerability in her voice, or maybe it was the realization that forcing her hand wouldn't solve anything. Not tonight. That evening, unable to sit idly by, Frank returned to the cabin alone. The forest seemed quieter this time, almost expectant, as though it knew he was coming. The air carried a faint chill despite the lingering warmth of late summer, and every step he took toward the moss-covered structure felt heavier than the last. When he reached the clearing, he hesitated, scanning the area. Something about the place unsettled him more now than it had the previous night. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this wasn't just a relic of the past. It was tied to Lillian, to their shared history, whether she admitted it or not. Kneeling near the porch, Frank began to dig instinctively, his fingers brushing against damp earth and decaying leaves. At first he found nothing but rocks and roots, but then his hand struck something solid. Carefully, he unearthed a small, mud-caked shoe, clearly a child's, and beside it, half buried in the soil, lay an old toy truck rusted with age. His stomach churned as he held them both, pieces of a puzzle he still couldn't fully comprehend. Driven by a mix of dread and determination, he searched the perimeter of the cabin until he spotted a rusted tin box wedged between two rotting floorboards. Pulling it free, he pried it open, revealing its contents, sketches drawn in pencil on yellowed paper. One depicted a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Lillian, her features softened by love and care. Beside her stood a young boy, the same one from the photograph, his wide eyes filled with innocence. But it was the third figure that made Frank's blood run cold. A man, or what remained of one. His face was distorted, scarred, nearly unrecognizable. Angry lines crisscrossed his features, suggesting burns or wounds so severe they obliterated any trace of humanity. The figure loomed menacingly over the others, his presence dominating the sketch despite being relegated to the background. Frank stared at the drawings, his mind struggling to piece together their meaning. Who was this burned man? What role had he played in Lillian's life and in Eli's? And why had these images been hidden here, buried alongside relics of a child long gone? As he sat there amidst the ruins of the past, Frank realized the truth was far darker than he'd imagined. Whatever tragedy had unfolded here had left scars too deep to heal, and Lillian had carried them alone all these years. Now it was up to him to uncover the rest of the story, no matter how painful it might be. But as he tucked the sketches back into the tin box and rose to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't truly alone in the clearing. Somewhere in the shadows, just out of sight, something or someone was watching, waiting. The next morning, Frank drove into town with the sketches tucked safely in his jacket pocket. He hadn't told Lillian where he was going. She'd barely spoken to him since their confrontation the day before, but he knew time was running out. Every discovery brought more questions, and every unanswered question tightened the knot of dread in his chest. The small library in town was quiet, its shelves lined with books that smelled faintly of dust and age. Frank approached the reference desk, his heart pounding, as he asked the librarian for access to old newspaper archives. She eyed him curiously, but led him to a microfilm machine without comment. He sat down, scrolling through decades of headlines until one stopped him cold. Local boy missing after camping trip turns tragic mother arrested. Frank's hands trembled as he adjusted the focus on the grainy black and white article from June 1989. According to the report, 5-year-old Eli Harper had disappeared during a family camping trip in the dense woods surrounding what was then called Pine Ridge Park. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but no trace of the boy was ever found. His mother, Jane Harper, was arrested shortly after the incident, accused of negligence due to allegations she had left her son unattended while arguing with an unidentified man at the campsite. But it was the accompanying mugshot that made Frank's breath hitch. The woman staring back at him bore an uncanny resemblance to Lillian. Same high cheekbones, same soft curve of the jawline, though years younger and weighed down by exhaustion and grief. It couldn't be. Could it? He scanned the rest of the article, piecing together fragments of the story. Jane Harper was described as a single mother who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. Friends quoted in the piece mentioned how devoted she was to her son, despite struggling financially. Yet there were whispers too. Rumors of a volatile relationship with a man whose name was redacted from the records. Some speculated he might have been involved in Eli's disappearance, though no evidence surfaced to support the claim. Frank leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If this Jane Harper really was Leanne, or some version of her, then the past she'd hidden wasn't just painful, it was catastrophic. A missing child, a wrongful arrest, a life shattered beyond repair. No wonder she'd buried herself in silence all these years. Still reeling, Frank dug deeper, pulling up census records and obituaries from the late 80s. What he found only deepened the mystery. Jane Harper vanished shortly after Eli's case went cold, leaving behind no forwarding address or explanation. Her name disappeared entirely from public records, as if she dropped off the face of the earth. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Somewhere along the way, Jane Harper became Lillian, and somehow she ended up here, in rural Maine, building a new life with him. But why? And why had she kept the truth about Eli locked away for so long? As Frank printed out copies of the articles and photos, he felt a pang of guilt. Was he betraying her trust by digging into her past like this? Or was he doing what any husband would do, trying to understand the woman he loved, even when she refused to let him in? Back home, Frank waited until Lillian left for another errand before spreading the documents across the dining table. He stared at the mugshot again, comparing it side by side with a recent photo of Lillian. The resemblance was undeniable. There was no doubt in his mind now. They were the same person. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. Anger at her deception, sorrow for the pain she must have endured, and fear of what else she might be hiding. The burned man from the sketches lingered in his thoughts, his scarred face haunting Frank like a ghost. Who was he? Had he hurt Eli? Was that why Lillian whispered apologies in the cabin? Before he could dwell further, a sound outside caught his attention. A soft rustling near the edge of the forest. Frank froze, his eyes darting toward the window. For a moment, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a shadow flickering just out of view. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. His pulse quickened. Whoever or whatever was watching him last night hadn't given up, and Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay not just in the past, but somewhere deeper in those woods. With trembling hands, he gathered the papers and shoved them into a drawer. Whether Lillian chose to confront her demons or not, he realized he had no choice but to face his own, because the truth about Eli Harper and the fire that scarred them both was waiting for him in the pines. The house was silent when Frank returned from the library, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Lillian sat at the dining table, staring blankly into a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her posture was rigid, as though she'd been expecting him or dreading his arrival. When he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, her head snapped up, eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "You know," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. Frank nodded, clutching the folder of documents tightly in one hand. He hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words, but they eluded him. Instead, he pulled out the mugshot and placed it on the table between them. "Jane Harper," he said softly, testing the name on his tongue like something bitter and unfamiliar. Lillian flinched at the sound of it, her fingers curling around the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. For a long moment, she didn't respond, just stared at the photograph as if seeing herself through someone else's eyes. Then, slowly, she nodded. That was me, she admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of years spent carrying the secret. A lifetime ago. Her confession came in fragments, each word heavier than the last. After Eli disappeared, the media circus surrounding the case consumed her. Neighbors whispered behind her back, accusing her of negligence. Even worse, the police grilled her relentlessly, dredging up every mistake she'd ever made as a mother, twisting them into evidence against her. And then there was him, the man from the sketches, whose face she couldn't bear to describe even now. His name was redacted in the records because she refused to speak it aloud during the investigation, terrified of what he might do if she implicated him. They said I killed my own son, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. They said I let him die, but I didn't. I swear I didn't. I loved him more than anything, more than life itself. Her voice broke and she buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. Frank stood frozen, torn between anger and heartbreak. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her he believed her, but the enormity of her deception loomed between them like an insurmountable wall. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally, his voice trembling with emotion. All these years, all the nights we sat together talking about our lives. You never once thought to mention this? I tried to leave it behind, she choked out, lifting her tear-streaked face to meet his gaze. After the trial fell apart and they dropped the charges, I knew I couldn't stay. Everyone looked at me like I was guilty, like I deserved to suffer for losing him. So I ran. I changed my name, moved halfway across the country, and started over. I thought maybe I could forget. But you didn't, Frank said quietly, his chest tightening as realization dawned. You kept coming back to the cabin, to those woods. Why? Because I can't stop hoping, she confessed, her voice breaking again. Every night I go there thinking maybe this time I'll find something. A sign, proof that he's still alive somewhere. That he didn't. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Frank sank into the chair across from her, his mind reeling. The pieces were falling into place now. The midnight walks, the toys in the cabin, the whispers among the trees. But one question remained unanswered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. What about the burned man? He asked cautiously. Who is he? What does he have to do with Eli? Lillian stiffened, her expression darkening. For a moment, she looked like a different person entirely, someone hardened by pain and fear. His name is Victor Kane, she said, her voice low and trembling. He was complicated, dangerous. We were together for a while before Eli was born, but it wasn't good. He had a temper, and he scared me sometimes. When I tried to leave him, he threatened to take Eli away, said no court would give custody to a woman like me. She paused, swallowing hard as if forcing herself to continue. The night Eli disappeared, we were camping near the cabin. Victor showed up drunk, shouting at me, blaming me for everything. I told him to leave, but he wouldn't go. I turned my back for just a minute to grab something from the tent, and when I looked back, Eli was gone. Victor swore he didn't hurt him, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Frank listened in stunned silence, his heart aching for the young woman she'd once been. A desperate mother caught in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Yet part of him couldn't help but wonder how much of her story was true. Had Victor really taken Eli, or had something else happened that night in the woods? As if reading his thoughts, Lillian reached across the table, gripping his hand with surprising strength. I'm not lying to you, Frank, she pleaded, her eyes filled with raw vulnerability. I've lied about so many things, but not this. Please, you have to believe me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air, mingling with decades of unspoken truths and buried pain. Frank wanted to trust her. He truly did. but the shadows of doubt lingered, whispering questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Finally, he squeezed her hand gently, offering what little reassurance he could. "We'll figure this out together," he promised, though he wasn't entirely certain what this even meant anymore. Whatever happened to Eli, whatever role Victor played, we'll find the truth. But as he glanced toward the window, where the forest loomed dark and endless beyond the glass, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they sought weren't waiting patiently to be uncovered. They were hiding, and they might not want to be found. The revelation came late that night, after hours of strained silence between them. Lillian sat on the edge of their bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Frank paced the room like a caged animal. The weight of her confession still hung heavy in the air, but there was something more, something she hadn't yet said. He could feel it in the way she avoided his gaze, in the restless tapping of her foot against the hardwood floor. "There's someone else," she blurted out suddenly, her voice barely audible over the sound of crickets chirping outside. "Someone who's been watching me." Frank stopped mid-step, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean, watching you?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Lillian hesitated, chewing on her lower lip as if debating whether to continue. Finally, she sighed and looked up at him, her eyes haunted. "I've seen him in the woods, always at a distance, always hidden among the trees. He doesn't come close, just stands there, staring. At first I thought it was my imagination, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's real. He's real." "Who is he?" Frank demanded, his mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know for sure," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But sometimes I think it's Victor." Frank froze, his blood running cold. Victor Kane, the man from the sketches. The one whose scarred face had haunted him since finding the tin box. According to the records Frank had uncovered, Victor was presumed dead in a house fire shortly after Eli's disappearance. Yet here Lillian was, suggesting he might still be alive, and lurking in the shadows of the very woods where Eli vanished. "He can't be," Frank said slowly, trying to make sense of it all. "The reports said he died. There was a fire. They never found a body," Lillian interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Just ashes and debris. They assumed he was inside when it happened, but no one actually saw him die. And now I see him out there, Frank, watching me, waiting." Her words sent a chill down his spine. If Victor really was alive, and if he'd somehow survived the fire, it meant he'd spent decades evading capture, living as a ghost. What kind of man would do that? And why would he resurface now, after all this time? "What does he want?" Frank asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Lillian shook her head, tears welling in her eyes again. "I don't know. Maybe revenge? Maybe closure? Or maybe he knows something about Eli, something he doesn't want me to tell anyone." The possibility hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Could Victor have taken Eli that night in the woods? Had he kept the boy hidden all these years, raising him? Or worse? The idea was almost too monstrous to consider, but it fit. The burned man in the sketches, the cabin filled with toys, Lillian's whispered apologies to a child she believed might still be alive. "We need to find him," Frank said firmly, gripping her shoulders. "If he's out there, we'll track him down. We'll get answers." "No!" Lillian cried, pulling away from him. Her fear was palpable, raw and visceral. "You don't understand. He's dangerous, Frank. More than you realize. If he thinks you're getting too close—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed smaller somehow, the walls closing in as the implications of her words sank in. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about survival. Whoever this man was, Victor or someone else, he clearly didn't want to be found. And if Frank pushed too hard, too fast, it might put both of them in grave danger. Still, he couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when they were so close to unraveling the mystery that had shaped Lillian's life, and by extension, his own. "We'll be careful," Frank promised, though even he wasn't sure how much weight those words carried. But we can't run from this forever. If Victor's alive, if he knows what happened to Eli, we owe it to ourselves to confront him. Lillian nodded reluctantly, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. For the first time in years, she seemed ready to face the past instead of running from it. But as they sat together in the dim light of their bedroom, the faint rustle of leaves outside served as an ominous reminder. The forest held secrets darker than either of them could imagine. And somewhere within its depths, the stranger in the smoke waited, watching, and biding his time. The next morning, Frank returned to the library with a singular focus. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay buried in the past, hidden in files long forgotten by everyone except those who had something to hide. The librarian greeted him with a polite nod as he made his way back to the microfilm machine, but this time he wasn't content with newspaper clippings or public records. He needed access to the restricted archives. After some persuasion and a promise to handle everything carefully, he was granted permission to sift through the old police reports stored in the basement. It took hours of painstaking work, flipping through dusty folders and scanning faded typewritten pages, before he found what he'd been searching for, the missing case file on Eli Harper's disappearance. His hands trembled as he opened it, the brittle paper crackling under his touch. At first glance, much of the information matched what he already knew. The camping trip, the argument between Lillian, then Jane, and Victor Kane, the subsequent search efforts that turned up nothing. But then he came across a section marked Confidential Restricted Access, its edges singed as though it had narrowly escaped destruction in a fire. What he read there made his stomach churn. According to the report, Russell Harper, Eli's biological father and Jane's estranged husband, had not died in the blaze as originally presumed. Witnesses claimed that they saw him fleeing the scene shortly after the fire erupted, his face badly burned but alive. Investigators initially suspected arson, given the circumstances, but without concrete evidence linking Russell to the crime, the case went cold. Over time, focus shifted away from him and onto Jane, leaving Russell's whereabouts unknown. But the most chilling detail came at the end of the document, a handwritten note from one of the detectives assigned to the case. It read, "New intel suggests RH may have abducted EH during the chaos of the fire. Motive unclear, but sources indicate possible custody dispute, personal vendetta against JH if true. Boy likely relocated out of state. All leads currently dead ends." Frank stared at the words, his mind racing. Russell Harper. Not Victor Kane, the man Lillian had described as volatile and dangerous, but Eli's own father. Had he orchestrated the entire thing? Taken his son in revenge for some unresolved grievance against Lillian? And if so, where had they gone? As he pieced together the timeline, a grim picture began to emerge. The fire hadn't just destroyed their home, it had erased any trace of Russell and Eli, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. For decades, people assumed Eli was dead, lost forever in the woods. But what if he wasn't? What if Russell had kept him hidden all these years, raising him under a new identity, far from prying eyes? The implications were staggering. If Eli was still alive, then every whispered apology Lillian made in the cabin, every toy she laid out like an offering, carried a glimmer of hope, not despair. But if Russell had indeed taken him, it raised darker questions about the kind of life Eli might have endured. Was he a prisoner of his father's bitterness, forced to live in fear? Or had he grown up unaware of the truth, believing his mother abandoned him? Frank closed the file, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't confront Lillian with this yet, not until he understood more. She'd already been through enough, carrying the guilt of losing her son while being vilified by the world. Telling her that Russell might be alive and possibly responsible for Eli's disappearance could shatter whatever fragile peace she'd managed to build. Instead, he decided to follow another lead, the fire itself. If Russell had survived, someone must have seen him afterward. Someone in town might remember details the police overlooked or chose to ignore. With renewed determination, Frank left the library and headed toward the local diner. a hub for gossip among the older residents who lived here long enough to recall events from 30 years ago. Inside the diner, the air smelled of coffee and fried eggs. Frank slid into a booth near the window, ordering a cup of black tea to blend in. When the waitress, a kindly woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair, brought his drink, he struck up a casual conversation about the history of Pine Ridge Park. "Oh, you're looking into that old camping area?" she asked, leaning on the counter. "Used to be quite popular before the fire." "The fire," Frank echoed, feigning curiosity. "I heard it destroyed a family's home." "Tragic." Her expression darkened. "That's putting it mildly. Poor little Eli Harper disappeared right around the same time. Never found him, or his daddy for that matter. Folks said Russell Harper was a real piece of work, always arguing with Jane, storming off drunk half the time. Some think he set the fire himself just to spite her. And no one ever saw him again?" Frank pressed gently. "Well," she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "There were rumors. A few folks claimed they spotted a man matching his description, hitchhiking out of town days after the fire. Looked rough, though, face all bandaged up, limping like he'd been hurt bad. No one paid him much mind back then. Just figured he was some drifter passing through." Frank thanked her, his mind racing. If Russell had fled town injured, it meant he'd planned his escape carefully. Perhaps he'd even prepared a safe haven for himself and Eli ahead of time. But where would he go? Somewhere isolated. Somewhere no one would ask too many questions. As he left the diner, one thought lingered above all others. Russell Harper wasn't just a shadowy figure from the past. He was alive. And if Frank was right, he'd spent decades hiding in plain sight, keeping his son close while ensuring Lillian suffered alone. Now it was up to Frank to find him and bring Eli home. The forest was eerily silent as Frank and Lillian approached the cabin, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the oppressive darkness. Neither of them had spoken much on the drive over. The weight of what they might find pressed down on them like a storm cloud threatening to break. Lillian's hands trembled as she clutched the flashlight, her knuckles white against the cold metal. Frank walked beside her, his jaw tight with determination, though his mind raced with dread. They reached the clearing where the moss-covered cabin stood, its sagging structure looming like a specter in the moonlight. Something felt different tonight, the air heavier, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Frank's neck stand up. He glanced at Lillian, who seemed equally uneasy, her eyes darting toward the tree line as if expecting the burned man to step out from the shadows. "We're not leaving until we know the truth," Frank said firmly, more to reassure himself than her. She nodded, swallowing hard, and followed him inside. The interior of the cabin was just as they'd left it days earlier, dusty and decaying, filled with relics of a life long abandoned. But this time Frank noticed something new, faint scuff marks on the floorboards near the far wall, as though someone had dragged something heavy across them recently. His pulse quickened as he knelt to examine the area closer, running his fingers along the edges of the boards. "There's something here," he murmured, pressing down experimentally. A soft click echoed through the room, and a section of the floor shifted slightly, revealing a hidden latch. Lillian gasped, stepping back instinctively. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Frank didn't answer. Instead, he pried the board loose with his pocket knife, revealing a narrow trapdoor beneath. The hinges creaked ominously as he pulled it open, exposing a set of rickety wooden stairs leading into darkness. The smell of damp earth and mildew wafted up, mingling with something else, something metallic and sharp, like rust or blood. "Stay behind me," Frank instructed, gripping the flashlight tightly as he descended first. Lillian hesitated for only a moment before following, her breath shallow and uneven. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a cramped underground room, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with strange objects. Drawings covered every inch of available space, sketches of Lillian, some crude and hurried, others painstakingly detailed. Newspaper clippings about Eli's disappearance were tacked haphazardly alongside the drawings, yellowed with age but still legible. And then there were the shoes, dozens of them, arranged neatly on the shelves like trophies. Lillian let out a strangled sound, clutching Frank's arm as her eyes landed on the collection. Each pair was small, clearly belonging to children, and many were caked with dirt or mud. Some looked decades old, their leather cracked and worn, while others appeared almost new. One pair in particular still bore fresh streaks of wet mud, as though they'd been added recently. "Oh, God!" Lillian choked out, tears streaming down her face. "What is this place?" Frank didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the macabre display. Among the shoes were other items, tiny toys, scraps of fabric, even locks of hair tied with frayed ribbons. It was a shrine, or perhaps something darker. Whoever had created this room wasn't just remembering these children. They were obsessing over them. His flashlight beam swept across the far wall, where a large map of the surrounding woods had been pinned up. Red circles marked various locations, connected by lines drawn in shaky ink. Beneath the map, a series of dates and names were scrawled in jagged handwriting. One name stood out among the rest, Eli Harper. "This isn't just about you," Frank said quietly, his voice hollow with realization. "It's about all of them." "All of who?" Lillian asked, her tone desperate. "The missing kids," Frank replied grimly. "This person, this monster, has been taking children for years, maybe decades." He gestured to the muddy shoes, his stomach churning. "And whoever it is, they've been bringing them here." Lillian staggered backward, her legs giving way as she collapsed onto the dirt floor. Her sobs echoed through the confined space, raw and gut-wrenching. Frank wanted to comfort her, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the horrifying tableau before him. Every detail pointed to one chilling conclusion. They weren't dealing with a grieving father or a vengeful ex-husband. This was something far worse, a predator hiding in plain sight. As Frank examined the map more closely, he noticed something else, a red circle marked directly over the location of their home. Beside it, written in blocky letters, was a single word, "Next." A chill ran down his spine as he turned to Lillian, who was now staring at the map with wide, terrified eyes. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. "Now." But as they turned toward the stairs, the sound of footsteps above froze them in place. Slow and deliberate, each step reverberated through the cabin, growing louder as whoever it was approached the trapdoor. For a moment, neither of them moved, holding their breath as the world outside seemed to shrink to the size of the underground room. Then, with a deafening creak, the trapdoor slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. And somewhere above, a low laugh echoed through the night. The darkness of the underground room was suffocating, pressing down on Frank and Lillian as they struggled to process what was happening. The faint creak of floorboards above signaled movement, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo louder with each passing second. Then came the voice, a raspy, broken whisper that sent shivers racing down their spines. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed, barely audible over the sound of their ragged breathing. "You left him once. You won't do it again." Lillian clutched Frank's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. Her entire body trembled, but there was fire in her eyes, a mix of terror and resolve. She knew who this was. After all these years, the ghost from her past had finally revealed himself. "Russell," she called out, her voice shaking but defiant. "It's me, Jane. Let us go." There was a long pause, followed by a low, bitter laugh that grated like nails on a chalkboard. "Jane!" Russell spat the name like it was poison. "No, you're not Jane anymore, are you? You changed your face, your name, your whole damn life. But I know who you are, and I know why you're here." Frank stepped forward cautiously, raising his flashlight toward the trapdoor. "Russell Harper?" he demanded, his tone firm despite the knot of fear tightening in his chest. "We're not leaving until we find Eli." The mention of his son's name triggered something primal in Russell. There was a sharp intake of breath above, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering as he slammed his fist against the trapdoor. "He's gone," Russell roared, his voice cracking with rage and despair. "You took him away from me, just like you always planned." "We didn't take him," Lillian cried, tears streaming down her face. "I loved him, Russell. I would never hurt him." "Liar!" The word exploded through the cabin, reverberating like thunder. For a moment, silence fell heavy between them, all except for Russell's labored breathing. Then slowly the trapdoor creaked open, flooding the room with pale moonlight. Standing at the top of the stairs was a figure straight out of a nightmare. His face was a grotesque mask of scars, the burns distorting his features into something barely human. One eye was milky white, unseeing, while the other burned with manic intensity. He clutched a hunting knife in one hand, its blade glinting ominously in the dim light. "You think I don't know what you did?" Russell snarled, descending the stairs step by agonizing step. "You tried to take my boy from me. You turned everyone against me, made them believe I was some kind of monster." "Well, maybe you were right." Frank moved instinctively, positioning himself between Russell and Lillian. "Where is Eli?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "If you've hurt him—" "I didn't hurt him," Russell snapped, his tone shifting abruptly from fury to anguish. "He got away from me during the storm last fall, ran off into the woods and never came back." His good eye darted wildly, as if reliving the memory. "But I saw her, the woman who looks like you. She's been watching me, waiting for her chance, waiting to finish what she started." Lillian gasped, her knees buckling beneath her. Frank caught her before she could collapse, his mind racing. A storm last fall. That must have been when Eli escaped. And if Russell thought Lillian, or someone resembling her, had taken him, then Eli might still be alive. "He's trying to reach you," Frank whispered urgently, helping Lillian to her feet. To Russell, he said, "We're not here to hurt anyone. We just want to find our son." Russell hesitated, his grip on the knife faltering slightly. For a brief moment, the paranoia melted away, revealing the shattered man underneath. "He's alive?" he croaked, his voice trembling. "You're sure?" "Yes," Lillian choked out, stepping forward despite the danger. "Eli's alive. I can feel it. Please, Russell, if you know anything about where he is, tell us. We'll bring him home together." For a heartbeat, it seemed like Russell might relent. His shoulders sagged, the weight of years spent hiding and running, collapsing in on him. Then, suddenly, his expression hardened, the paranoia returning full force. "No!" he growled, raising the knife again. "You'll ruin everything, just like last time." Before either of them could react, Russell lunged forward, grabbing Lillian by the wrist and dragging her toward the stairs. Frank lunged after them, tackling Russell to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, the knife skittering across the dirt floor as they fought for control. Lillian scrambled away, her sobs echoing through the confined space. "Stop it!" she screamed, picking up the fallen flashlight and shining it directly into Russell's face. The sudden burst of light disoriented him long enough for Frank to pin him down. Breathing heavily, Frank wrestled Russell's arms behind his back, securing them with the belt from his own jacket. Defeated, Russell slumped to the ground, muttering under his breath about betrayal and lies. Lillian collapsed beside him, clutching her chest as if trying to hold herself together. "We need to call the police," Frank said firmly, pulling out his phone. "They'll find Eli. We'll make sure he's safe." But even as he dialed, Lillian shook her head, her gaze fixed on the map pinned to the wall. One location stood out among the others, a small cabin marked deep in the woods, circled repeatedly in red ink. Beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "He's here. He's close," she whispered, her voice filled with both hope and dread. "Eli's closer than we thought." And somewhere in the distance, beyond the trees and shadows, a faint whistle carried on the wind, a tune only a mother could recognize. The days that followed were a blur of activity and emotion. After securing Russell in the underground room, Frank called the authorities, who arrived within the hour. The sight of police officers combing through the cabin and surrounding woods was surreal, like watching a dam break after decades of silence. Officers swarmed the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched for evidence of Russell's crimes. Meanwhile, detectives questioned Lillian and Frank about Eli's disappearance, piecing together fragments of story that had been buried for far too long. Armed with the map found in the underground room, investigators focused their efforts on the location marked repeatedly in red ink, a remote cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was miles from any main road, accessible only by narrow trails choked with underbrush. When search teams finally reached it, they discovered signs of recent habitation, discarded food wrappers, fresh footprints in the mud, and a crude bed made of blankets and pine boughs. But most importantly, they found Eli Harper, or rather, the man he had become, was no longer the wide-eyed boy in the faded photographs. At 35, he bore little resemblance to the child Lillian remembered, his features hardened by years spent surviving in isolation. Yet there was something unmistakable about him, the tilt of his jaw, the curve of his smile when he finally stepped into the light, that told her, without a doubt, this was her son. The reunion took place at a small sheriff's office in town, its sterile walls doing little to contain the tidal wave of emotions that swept through the room. Lillian entered hesitantly, clutching Frank's hand like a lifeline, her heart pounding so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. When the door opened and Eli walked in, escorted by a kind-faced deputy, time seemed to stop. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eli stood frozen in the doorway, his expression guarded but curious, while Lillian stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Then slowly, tentatively, she stepped forward. "Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" He flinched slightly at the sound of his name, as though it belonged to someone else. But then his eyes met hers, and whatever walls he'd built around himself began to crumble. His lips parted, forming words he couldn't quite speak, and before either of them realized what was happening, they were in each other's arms, clinging desperately as if afraid the other might vanish. Frank watched from the sidelines, his own eyes misty with unshed tears. He'd spent years feeling disconnected from Lillian, believing her grief was a burden she carried alone. But now, seeing her strength, the way she held her son, as though willing the years apart to dissolve, he understood her in a way he never had before. She wasn't just a woman haunted by loss. She was a mother whose love had endured against all odds. "I'm so sorry," Lillian sobbed, pulling back just enough to look at him. "I thought you were gone. I thought I'd lost you forever." Eli shook his head, his voice hoarse but steady. "You didn't lose me, Mom. Not really. I remembered you, even when I didn't know who you were." It turned out that after escaping Russell during the storm, Eli had wandered the woods until collapsing near the remote cabin. A reclusive hunter had taken him in, feeding and sheltering him, but keeping him hidden out of fear of drawing attention. Over time, Eli came to believe he was simply another drifter, someone without a past worth remembering. The truth about his identity remained buried, until recently when fragmented memories began surfacing in dreams and fleeting moments of clarity. As the details emerged, Frank felt a swell of pride, not just for Lillian, but for Eli too. Despite everything he'd endured, he'd retained a quiet resilience, a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. And those scars, both visible and invisible, marked them both. There was a chance now to heal, to rebuild what had been torn apart. Later that evening, as they sat together in the living room of their home, Frank poured 3 cups of tea and handed one to Eli, who accepted it with a shy smile. For the first time in years, the house felt full, not just with people, but with possibility. Questions lingered, of course. How would Eli adjust to life outside the woods? Could Lillian ever fully forgive herself for the years they'd lost? And what would become of Russell, whose twisted actions had shaped all their lives? But for now, those questions could wait. What mattered was that they were here, together. As Frank listened to Lillian recount stories from Eli's childhood, her voice filled with equal parts laughter and sorrow, He realized how much he still had to learn about the woman he loved. Her strength wasn't defined by perfection or invulnerability. It was rooted in her ability to endure, to keep searching even when the world told her to give up. And perhaps Frank thought that was something they could all carry forward, not just as individuals, but as a family reborn. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, its shadows retreating beneath the rising moon. Somewhere within it lay the remnants of secrets long buried, but tonight those secrets no longer held power over them. They had faced the darkness and found each other waiting on the other side.